Okay, good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1337. Yeah. Top of the page, we finished the parentheses. Let me review what we learned, and I'll put it maybe some further explanation to help make it easier to understand. So let me give a little overview of what is called in Chesed. You may be familiar with this language. And Etzem and Giluiim, or sometimes referred to Etzem and Giluiim. So these are two words which loosely translated would mean core essence. Etzem as core essence, core or essence. And Giluiim or Giluiim would mean extension, expression, revelation. It's a fundamental way of looking at everything in life, to be honest, both on a human level and also on a divine level. I'll first start on a human level because from my flesh I behold God. It's just easier to understand and relate to. And then we'll apply it and look at the moral of it, how it is l'mayla above. So maybe think of a relationship between two, let's start with two friends. It could also be siblings, it can be spouses, but I'll start with friends. You get to meet someone the first time. Two people meet at a party, at a fabrengen, I don't know, at an event, whatever it may be. And you strike up a conversation and you start relating to each other, which means you start understanding each other, appreciating. And even if it hasn't become yet, that person hasn't become your friend, what's happening in the language that we're discussing? You're sharing Giluiim. What have you experienced in life? What have I experienced in life? Where do you come from? Where were you born? What do you do? What are your interests? So what are the people sharing? They're sharing their personality a bit. They're sharing their interests. They're sharing their life experiences, whatever it may be. I'm not even going into details now. I'm not even getting into whether it's a profound conversation now, but bottom line is, you're not sharing necessarily your etzem, because the etzem of a person is not really subject to communication. In the language of the Rambam, in Moreh Nevuchim and other places, other philosophers, etzem bilti mispashet, etzem bilti misgala. The etzem really defies expression and defies revelation. But let me go back to my mashal and continue, and you'll see where I'm going with this. So you strike up, you start conversing, then you become friends. Whatever the reason, either you're kindred spirits, you identify with each other, you like each other, there's common interest, you're stimulated, you make a chavrusa, you learn with each other. And as friends, what happens with friends, good friends? You begin to trust each other more. As you trust, people share more. And they could share things they would not share with someone else. A confidence, a personal experience, and so on. You'll even allow yourself to be vulnerable with someone that you really care about and really become friendly with. Now, I'll take this over from friends now to spouses, because we're talking about in a healthy marriage, a healthy relationship, the sharing becomes even deeper. And I don't just mean because there's a physical intimacy and that part, but I mean even in trust. You are very vulnerable with your spouse. Again, I'm talking a healthy relationship where there's communication and you know each other, even the strengths, the weaknesses, and you're fine. You don't have to put on a show. You could be more of yourself. Let's put it that way. Whereas when you go to work, for example, or you meet strangers, or you go out there, then all of us have our masks and we all have our costumes and outfits. I'm not saying necessarily that we're faking it, but we definitely have our armor up, our defenses. And based on who you meet, you allow them to see which part you want them to see. Whereas when you're with someone that you're much closer to, you don't have all those layers and levushim, so to speak, garments, and you allow more of yourself to be exposed. Now, the question is how much more? How far can it go? How close can two people become? So you can make the argument that at the end of the day, as close as two people may be, it's still ultimately all Giluiim. It could be Giluiim on deeper levels, Chesed Nelamim, even things that are concealed from others, the person you know well or knows you well, knows about. You can go even deeper and deeper and deeper into the inner psyche and consciousness, or even super consciousness of a person. But the argument could be made that you're going to come to a wall at some point. Because at the end of the day, two people are ultimately not one. And the most innermost parts of yourself, things that you yourself can't even articulate. We learned before that there's an atzmi part of you that is built in mizgal, even to yourself you're not even aware of. You may sense it or you may not sense it, but it's not, as I said before, it's not subject to expression. There are things like liba lepuma legalia, it says, that which is in the heart cannot be expressed in the lips, in the mouth. Like sometimes you'll say, I don't have the words for it. I can't quite express it to you. Or even sometimes things that we talk about, let's say when you tell someone, I love you, or sometimes it's just a sigh, or sometimes it's even silence, can often capture deeper expression of a person's innermost self than many words. So how far can one go? That would be an interesting question. Can two people really bond and connect on the etzem to etzem? Like nafshi kshuri b'nafshi, when you have that expression. Like we see, for example, a parent and a child. A mother will feel about her child even when the child is away, and we know that there's instances where something, God forbid, happens to a child and a mother knows. And it's not Giluiim, because it's not something that makes sense even. It's like, how would you know? You didn't hear it from someone. You didn't read about it. It's just a deep sense. And you see this, there's certain prescience, a certain type of sense of things, intuition. So the question is how deep that goes. Now, here is where I want to move over to what it is l'mayla, because ultimately God created us, and He said that even two etzems can connect. Like when we say that a husband and wife are really two halves of one whole, soulmates. Why? Because the Eibishter created man and woman as one androgynous creature. Then He split them into two. So be'etzem they are one. So their etzem is one. However, they live in the world of Giluiim. In the world of Giluiim, they're two different personalities. Even more than Giluiim, they became two different individuals. You could say the way they experience the etzem is different, but the heart and the soul and everything is united and originates in the Tselem Elokim in which they were created, in that divine image. The question is whether they have the sensitivity and the capacity and wherewithal to reach that atzmizdika place in themselves. That's another question. Not everybody's trained to do that. Not everybody has the courage to do. Not everybody knows how to go that far. And that's really deep levels of bittul bring you to that place. But it's very clear that the more bittul you have, the more you will have that connection. The less bittul, the connection will be on more outer levels and surface levels. So what's the point I'm making with all of this? That you see clearly that we, even human beings, have an etzem and have a spashus, or etzem and giluiim. Now, of course, all this originates from God. That God, the way, obviously, the Eibishter is not bound by this. We are, because we're created this way. But the Eibishter chose because He wanted to have a dira b'tachtenim, and tachtenim, the way the world exists, is a world of giluim and etzem. So therefore, He Himself also, so to speak, has these two dimensions. Now, not to say, God forbid, that there's two aspects to God, because there's only Hashem Echad, like we learned yesterday and we learn all the time. But He manifests, just like the Eibishter manifests in Chochmah Bina Das, and that's not a contradiction to His unity, because He remains above them all and is the essence of them all and unites them all. So the same thing here, we talk about Atzmus and Giluiim. With Giluiim would be the word for Oir, and Atzmus would be the word for the Etzem that defies and transcends and negates any definition. So as soon as you say the word Oir, you're already talking about definition. You're already talking about some form of expression. Even if it's a very profound expression, even if it's an expression that is beyond anyone, but expression it is. And when you talk about etzem, going back to the expression, built in mispashit, etzem is not bound by and is not defined by expression. It is what it is, and that's it. Just as it is with us. And here we come to the answer that Chesed tells us that there is no limit. We could reach all the way to the etzem of the Eibush, but there's a condition. You need bittul. Bittul is your calling card, your entrance card. The only way in, the more bittul, the more you can allow. Now, I go back to the classic sikha I quote so often from Purim, from Tainus Esther Tovshem Mem Ches, which is also today I found it in Ponim Yofetz, the classic story, which is actually the psukim that we're reading now. When Moshe says to Hashem on the mountain, when he's beseeching and begging God to forgive the people, he says, Hareini nos chvedecha, show me your glory, your honor. And God says to him, Le yireini odem v'chai. Literally these verses where he places him on the rock, and all that we talked about here, where it's all in the same context. So God says to him, no man can see me and live. Then a few verses later, he says, okay, space is with me. You stand on this rock. I'll put you in this crevice. When my COVID passes by, you'll see what? You'll see my back. And my face you won't see. So the Rebbe asked the questions, the obvious questions. You already said no man can see me and live. Why does the Eibishter have to rub it in and say, no, my face you won't see? We know that. Secondly, what was Moshe's Havamina? Moshe didn't understand you can't see God and live, that if you knew God, you'd be God. We all understand that Moshe needed, what was Moshe's consideration here? And finally, why does the Torah tell us this story? If Moshe's request was rejected, why does the Torah have to tell us that Moshe asked and he was told no? Tzaddik Geizer Kodesh Baruch Hu Mekayim, when a tzaddik asks for something, God fulfills it. Why do we need to hear that? And it wasn't fulfilled, seemingly. So the Rebbe answers, and as I said, I found it afterwards in the Ponim Yofis from the Baal HaFlaw, where he says like this, that the way you read the verse is uponai, and I show you my back and my face. You'll see my back and my face, and the comma comes not by before uponai, but after uponai. In other words, it doesn't say you'll see my back, uponai lo yiro, the second phrase of that verse. My face you will not see, but rather you will see my back and my face, comma, lo yiro. But my face you will see by not looking. In other words, through shlila, yediyas hashlila. So yediyas achiv, the things you see, giluiim, we can see directly because it's not the etzem. But if you want to experience the etzem, the core, it has to be through not looking. But then you'll experience it. And we're not saying through annihilation. We're just saying it can't be you that sees it. You have to suspend yourself in face of the panai, and then you can see it. And that answers all the questions. That's why the Torah tells us, because the end of the day, he did show it to him. He just told him the secret of how to see me. Want to really see my etzem. Now, bring it back to what we're discussing. The question then is this. Fine, we understand that Oyer is Giluiim, but is there anywhere an expression of etzem in our lives that we can hold on to? So he says, yeah, that's the root of the kelim. The etzem, that the kelim are created from the atzmizdika power that's higher than the power of Giluiim. Gilui is created from the shadish of how God chooses to manifest and express. That's the shadish of Giluiim, of Ur. Kelim, or the Rishimu, which is the root of Kelim, or in different nations, Gevurah. In the translation, Takbeira Sa'atzmis is the intensity, is reflecting an intensity from the Etzem, but it's not expressed through Gili. It's expressed through Helam, through concealment. And where does concealment manifest? In Kelim. So in that sense, what he's saying here in this parenthesis that we learned, he's explaining how Chesed in Chesed is a manifestation of Giluiim Hispashtus, definitions. And Gevurah, Tagberis, that intensity is an expression that comes from Helama Atzmi, that ultimately is an expression more of Etzem. Now, important to point out, the Etzem in its pure form is neither Helam or Gili. However, when you have both the track of Helam, Gevurah, and the track of Chesed, together they both teach us that the Etzem is beyond both of them. But the Helam teaches us more than what Giluim itself carries. So in many ways, when you're sitting with someone you love, or someone you're really deeply connected with, words are not always the way you connect. Your union, your bond can be through silence, as deep as it is through words, if not deeper. Why? Because silence is not silence. Silence doesn't mean you're not saying anything. Silence means I don't have words to express my connection with you. Does that mean there's no connection? You could say it's even a deeper connection. It's so deep, there's no expression. I heard when the Rebbe first met his mother, after many years of separation, the Rebbe left Russia in 1928, the end of 28. It was after Simchas Torah, that's when the Tafresh Peiches. The next year, the Rebbe got married. So they left Tafresh Peiches after Tishrei. So it would be like October, something like October 1928. So when he saw his mother last, I don't know. It could have been that year. It could have been a year before, 2 years before. But he met her, the next time he met her, we know, was 1947. 1947, she came out of Russia. So we're talking about at least 20 years. And he met her, he went to France. He was in America. The Rebbe was already in America. I'm talking about the Ramash. He was still not the Rebbe, but he was going to be the Rebbe in 1950. So he went to Paris to greet her and bring her back. He spent several months there, and then he brought her back to America with her in 1947. Interesting, just for the record, the Rebbe's second time coming to America with his mother was the same day, Chav Ches Sivan, 28th of Sivan, like the first time when he came with the Rebbetzin in 1941, just as an aside. Upon him, I heard from people who were there that when he first met his mother, the first time, and they embraced, that they just hugged each other for 20 minutes without saying a word to each other, not a word, just hugging, maybe crying. I don't know the details, but that's what I heard. So in other words, connection is not always in Giluiim. A connection, atzmizdika connection has other ways of connecting, and that's ultimately manifests more in Gevurah, in the Tagberis, Gevurah, like he said, Tagberis, which also comes down to his chalkus, where it comes down to many details. It's not necessarily one singular flow, but it's coming, like he said, it's coming from a place that is higher. It's not his chalkus that comes from limit. It's coming from a place, like he said, that is chalkus and Ein Sof, because they're not opposites when you're dealing with atzmos, as we learned yesterday. So bottom line is what I wanted to just give was context a bit in understanding what we learned. So when you talk about measure now, so real measure, midah mamish, like he said, is an oir. That's what he said. That an oir, even though it's bli gvul, but nevertheless it has some form of definition, as we learned. Midah v'gvul, midah. Or as medida, and like chutz la'etzem. It's like a dover nesaf, an additional thing. Aval etzem ha'oir, and kolshkein atzmus ha'ein sof does not come in measure, and that which is a measure, he calls that medida atzmis, that's muchusa etzem itself. And that he explained in two efanim, im shemedida mitzad etzem, which means purely due to the intensity of the etzem, tagberis atzmis, and that just manifests in detail simply because of its intensity. Oisha atzmus moided atzmei, or atzmus itself within himself chooses to measure and place himself in a defined and confined state. That should be niskabel bepnimius. And both of them is not a form of medida, it's a chelik of the etzem. Anyway, I just wanted to give this overview to help a bit understand etzem and ispashtus, etzem and giluiim. Okay. So with that, I'm ready to read on, unless somebody has any questions.
These two afanim are different ways that the Eibishter, say, reveals, or that one can understand the atzmus, or one is hashpastis and one is etzem.
No. They're both etzem. They're both the higher level of atzmus.
Okay. So why does he give two? I guess I don't understand why he's saying there's two ways or two ofanim.
Because there simply are. It's just a fact.
Can you give an example of each that's more palpable, more understandable, to just help distinguish them?
Well, I think I did. One was, for example, when something is like he says, tagberis. When I explained yesterday at length the difference between measure as we understand it. When you break something down, let's say you take a cake and you cut it into pieces, it's called actual measure. Every person gets a piece of the cake. When an atzmi breaks something down, it comes down from his atzmi's power, they share intensity, that it comes down into infinite pieces. So they're not really measurable in the sense of defined pieces. It's just an expression of his atzmisdika power, which can break into like striking, like an anvil, striking something and sparks flying infinitely. That's what he calls here. He says that Gevurah atzmis baba b'chinas ischalkus. That's one. Oi, a different way to put it, a different expression of it would be, like I said, that God chooses to manifest himself in a particular location, in the Kodesh Kodashim, for example, in a way that should be miskabel and primis. And that too is not like a piece of cake. It's not a measurable item. It's that he is, the Etzem itself is choosing to manifest itself. Like when we say, Etzem kshetefes bechalke at the tefes bekule. So even though it's a chelik, but it's really a chelik of it's all an extension of Etzem. Whereas in Oyer, it's initially Chadchila structured that it should be actual parts. Chachma, Bina, Das will be in the spheres, or higher levels, the Rotzen to the Heitzel, Livrei, to emanate, to create. So these are two ways that you can explain it, or two different forms of manifesting Etzem in distinction.
So is it fair to say that when you're having Medidas Etzem, by us, it's dafka the opposite? We are not going to see measurement, at least in our terms, even though it may be medida by the Eibishter. When it's Medidas Etzem, it's dafka not going to be something measurable for us because it's coming from Asmus, which is beyond Giluiim, beyond our perspective of measurement. That's the paradox.
You lost me there. I'm not sure what you. I would not compare us to Atzmos because we don't have the Medida Atzmis necessarily.
I wasn't doing that. I was saying our perspective, our inability to perceive Atzmis means that when something is Medida be'etzem by the Eibishter, Dafka, we can't see that measurement. Whereas if it's Behishpastus, it's Giluiim, that's something we can measure.
So that's a little abstract for me. The way I would put it was what I said yesterday. A mitzvah is a good example because a mitzvah is a medida atzmis. When God said Shabbos, kashrus, tefillin, so from our point of view, these are specific, measurable, distinct mitzvahs. From God's point of view, it's atzmi manifesting in these. Each one is rotzna elyon, or even higher, the etzem of the Eibishter, as he chooses these different mitzvahs. So in that context, what are you trying to say, for example? So yes, I mean, we human beings, generally, we measure things, like I said, in time and space, or even conceptual time and space, but we do have access to Medida Atzmis. When the Eibishter puts himself into Torah, anon nafshik shavis yavis, or into mitzvahs, we have access to the Medida Atzmis that is referring to here.
Well, as usual, your examples are better than mine. I guess I was thinking, let's say rain, for example, because he talked about that as an example. When he measures rain, we couldn't count all the raindrops that come down in a rainstorm. I mean, I suppose, but it's not a good example either. But if
it's not about counting, it's about, is the measure true definition of actual parameters, or is it the parameters that are an Etzem is choosing to manifest in, or the intensity of the Etzem is expressing itself in that?
Whether or not the expression fully captures.
I would suggest listening to yesterday's class, because I believe I did elaborate a lot on explaining the difference between the two types of measuring.
For what it's worth, I listened to it twice. Okay,
but then I'm not sure what the question is that you're asking me.
It's more clear today than it was yesterday. Let's keep going. I don't want to disrupt the class, but I understood what you're saying.
I will give an example that I just thought of that is not a perfect example, but like when a person, we've learned that when a melech, a king, is in besimcha, he's marrying off a child, or for that matter, anyone marrying off a child, he will splurge and give everybody, whether it's wise people, poor people, wise people, less wise people, ministers, he will like completely be being a giving mode to everybody. But that's not medida from Oyer, that's a medida from Etzem. because the intensity of his joy, so he's just in a place of complete expression to everybody and to everything, like almost an infinite expression of kindness in all different forms and fashions. So I'm not going to say it's exactly this because it's not necessarily etzem like it is in Atzmos, but it would be an example as opposed to when the king says, okay, today I'm going to be benevolent and people who earn their way, I'm going to be giving them a bonus or I'm going to be giving them a gift. Where there it's measured and there's a calculation. Whereas when it's coming from that shared ecstasy and joy, there's that type of like, everybody's, I'm sure, been in times like that where you're just in that, it was extravagant, not extravagant, what's the word I want to use? Giving mode. There's a word that I was going to say, I forgot the word. Extravagant, not extravagant.
Euphoria?
Not euphoria either. There's a word where a person is magnanimous.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, just a thought that I had when we're talking here, right?
That's a good one. That's a good muscle.
The muscle for the other one is like when often I talk about soul travel, where the soul travels through a song, a body travels through walking through our legs and vehicles. So I often point out that there are people who have millions, if not billions, of frequent flyer miles, but their soul hasn't moved an inch. And there are people who may not have any frequent flyer miles, but their soul moves miles and miles, which means somebody can be a person who's like a jet setter and running around everywhere in the world and not fundamentally really moving in any spiritual sense. Then there's a person on a Shabbos or on a weekday chooses to sit under a talus and daven for 7 hours and physically may not move, but their soul is moving beyond. That's an example of medida atzmis that he's describing here. Just because he's sitting in one spot, don't think that he's limited, because he's choosing to take his whole being and right now going to daven to God when nothing else in the world matters. And he's in a complete, so he's, on one hand, he's only one place, he's not moving about, but it's an etzem choosing to be there. And a medida in Samach Vovi says, Hagbola b'ritzenis, when you choose to define and when you choose to limit yourself, it's not called true limitation. Limitation is when it's imposed on you. You have no choice but to go to sleep at night because a person has to sleep. You have no choice but you have to eat, or other things that we are limited by. But when a person chooses limitation, or in this case, when you talk about Atzmus chooses to limit himself, it's not real limit. It's another way of explaining the second Eifen. The first example was for the first Eifen. The second Eifen is this example, where it's a choice where you're taking all of you and I want to be here right now. This is not me, does not mean I have to be, but I want to be here. And that has a certain element of medida atzmis that he's describing here.
Thank you very much. Those are very helpful examples.
Okay, good. So let's go now to page 1337, the new paragraph. And now he's going to bring us back to Butzina de Cardenissa, that hard or dark flame that signifies Gevuros of Atik, which manifests the Moichis Temah, from where the Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim come, which is the level of Tzur, the stone, the rock. So he's taking us back now to the end of the paragraph on page 1334, which which then came a long explanation that we're just now coming to, which is where the Gevuros, the second interpretation of Gevuros. He says, "V'adugma mekol zeh," and the example from all of this, Yuvan Lamaila, will help us understand. From the example of all this, we'll understand how it is above the Bechinas Gevuros, the Atik, who amitis hamoker lahanetzolim kulam, v'loy Bechinas Chesed Atik. That Gevurah of Atik, remember Atik, for all practical purposes, is higher than the Shtalshlus, to the point we have even Atik at the top of the Kav, at the head of the Kav. So Atik always refers to a level that is removed from the word netak. Removed is the higher level of Chesed. It could be Atik of Atzilus, but it could also be Atik of Adam Kadmon. And even Atik before the Tzimtzum, there's also a level of like that, Keser Malchus of Ein Sof. So what's Gevurah the Atik, he says? That's the true source of the Netzolim, of the emanations, Kulam, all of them, and not Chesed the Atik, Gevurah the Atik. So he's now going to explain why. Based on what we just learned, as the example. All this was an example to understand how it is Lamaila, to understand Gevurah of Atik. So he says, V'agam de Chesed Omer Yivra. So when it says in the Medrash, that when it says, when the Eibishter asked Chesed and Emes, should I create the world? And Emes said no, because it's Elam Malish Karim, it's a world filled with lies. And Chesed said yes, Uksiv Kemati Elam Chesed Yebona. Because Chesed said there'll be a world filled with Chesed, and basically the world comes from Chesed. God's Chesed and kindness, and Chesed Amar Yivra. Kindness dictates, kindness and love dictates to create, to share, a flow of, to share, to create, to transmit. Kiyamati Elam Chesed Yebona. Shezeh B'chinas Chesed the Zod Atzilus. This is the level of Chesed of Zah of Atzilus. So Zah is Zahir Ampin, the small face, is the structure of the 6 middays of Atzilus, and it begins with Chesed. Chesed Gevurah Teferes Netzach Heid Yesod is Zah. So Chesed of Zah Atzilus is referring to the Chesed, the God is the flow from which creation comes from. So why are we saying it's coming from Gevurah of Atik? And he continues. We have to say the Kamoy Kain Ubchinas Chesed Arich Atik. That just like Chesed and Zav Atzilus is the source of creation, God's Chesed, God's kindness, is what creates. So the same thing, the root of same thing with Chesed of Arich in Keser and Atik. So too, it also comes from there. Like he says in Tanya, in Shar Yochid Amunah, Chelik Beis is the second section in Tanya. Even though Sefer Shabbeini technically is only the name of the first, but the Rebbe points out that Sefer Shabbeini is used by the Rabbeim over the whole Tanya. So the second section of Tanya, chapter 4 in Shar Yochid Amunah says, Be'inyan HaGodel, Midas Chesed V'Ispashtus Achayis. He talks there about HaGodel, HaGibur V'Aneira, that when you say HaGodel, the God's greatness is Chesed. So Midas Chesed V'Ispashtus Achayis. That's where the flow of energy that creates and sustains existence comes from Chesed. Ki ba migduloshe shel Kadosh Baruch Hu b'kfei dei ba'atzmei. Ki Godel Hashem. It comes from God's greatness, and Gedula is another name for Chesed, from God's greatness. B'kfei dei ba'atzmei. He himself is greatness. Ki Godel Hashem, because God is great. Ulechem mashpia gam kein chayis v'yisavus ein kates, and because of that greatness and goodness, that's why he also transmits vitality and creation, ein kates without end, sheteva hatev lehetiv, because the nature of something good is to do goodness, is to do kindness. So what do we see from this? That creation comes as a result of chesed. So why does he say that it comes from Gevurah of Atik and not Chesed of Atik? But Kol Mokem, nevertheless, and this is the answer. In order for there to be the descent of the infinite divine light to create the creations, and also to emanate the emanations. Remember, Bria and below is called Nivroim. They're actually created Yesh. Atzilus is called Netzolim. They're emanations. They're not quite creations. They're more an extension of the divine. They're divine in nature. So in order for there to be the Yerid of Ein Sof, to create and to emanate the emanations, so it's not so simple, because they're infinitely distant from Atzmus. So how does that leap come? So Chesed is the flow of goodness that God drives that drives the creation. But how does this leap take place? It's Ein Arech L'Gabe Atzmus. And he's now going to bring a famous quote from the Alter Rebbe, that I think it's also from the Mekubalim, from the Pardes, I believe.
I think
it's rooted in the Pardes. The Ramak, yeah. The Yeser Mishe'en Arech Asiyah L'Gabe Atzilus, Ein Arech Atzilus L'Gabe Ein Sof. So the statement goes like this, that as distant that Asiya, the world of Asiya, is compared to Atzilus as infinitely distant. Atzilus is even more distant from Ein Sof than Asiya is from Atzilus. So, in other words, there's a tremendous paradigm shift going on here from Ein Sof to get to Atzilus. Because yes, again, more than the infinite distance between between Asiya compared to Atzilus, Ein Arech Atzilus, L'gabe Ein Sof. Atzilus is more distant compared to Ein Sof. Ubefrat zois sheyiyu hanatzolim b'bchinas mitzias dover. And specifically, this becomes even more so that the netzalim, which means the emanations of Chachma, Bina, Das, and so on, should be a mitzias dover. They should be of substance. V'hainu shetia Chachma b'bchinas Giluiim. That Chachma should be in a revealed state Giluiim. Shu b'chinas Yesh v'dover ma. That turns it into a Yesh v'dover ma. Yesh doesn't mean ego here. Yesh means a defined substance, a defined entity. And dover ma, it's not like the 10 hidden spheres, which are completely submerged in and subsumed within the oil. We're talking about a netzalim that have shape and form. That's true, they're netzalim. So in addition to what he just said, that Atzilus is more distant from Ein Sof than Asiya is from Atzilus, especially when you're talking about the netzalim as they become substance, they have identity and gilui. That means that this is all explaining why we're going to need Gevurah, not just Chesed. So he continues in the parentheses. So for Chachma to become a substance, of substantial entity, for that requires that the Eir should descend, the Eir of Chachma should descend ba'efen kazeh in such a manner, sheyislabish b'klei Chachma, that it should manifest in the container of Chachma, shezeu ma'ayin liyesh ala Eir k'moshen is ba'le'il. That is ultimately a form of ayin liyesh, because the ayin is the way the Eir is separate from keli. But as the Eir has to go into a keli, we learned earlier, that in other words, the ayin of the Eir, as it's above, completely beyond kelim, for it to become an Eir that's going to go into a keli is ma'ayin liyesh ala Eir. So the state of ayin of Eir has to become in a form of a yesh, which will enter into the keli, like we learned earlier. So here you find subtly a form of ayin and yesh ma'ayin. By nivroim and creation, for sure it's yesh ma'ayin, because that's the definition of a creation. But even Atzilus, he says, for it to be the defined state of Chachma, you also need a subtle form of a leap from a state of nothingness and complete nullification and bittul talakus. So it should even have the identity called Chachma. Usheyi isav is klei Chachma. That's the Eir of Chachma. And also in order to have the creation of the keli of Chachma, the container of Chachma, so even if you say that Chachma, the Eir of Chachma is still somewhat ayin, koyach ma, the ma, it's more bottle, but the keli for sure is a yesh of Chachma. Ubezin yanim elu, and these two things, the Eir and the keli of Chachma, shneim heim bechinas eish uchla, k'may eish nechaz bepsila davka, or k'may shekosab l'kutatei dibra maskil p'yem azeh yechaper hanal. Okay, I'll explain. The Rebbe Rashab is tying it back together to something he brought from the Likutei Torah on page 1334. So there he explains that when the Neshama comes down below, the Eir is like the flame, and the way the flame manifests within existence in the body and in existence is like the psila, the wick, and the etzim, and the wood. So when you see a flame burning, it needs to have, the flame is the flame, eshuchla, but the flame, for it for actually burn, it needs fuel. It needs something to hold on to. So he calls that the psila and the etzim, the wick and the wood. So in Likutei Torah, that he brought earlier, if you recall, we were speaking about an etzavta latzur. So there,
I posted it. It's in the WhatsApp thread. I posted it. It's in the WhatsApp thread. That passage I posted in the WhatsApp thread. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, so there he explains that the Eir manifests in two levels, and two levels is the Eir as it comes into the keli and the keli itself. So he says he's just connecting it. So he says that these two things, they are both eish uchla, k'may eish sheneches b'psila dafke. They're the eish uchla, but the eish that consumes. What is it consuming? It's consuming the psila, the wick. So both of them require a yerida, because the eish has to come down into something of substance. That's what he's saying. And why he's bringing that here, I'm assuming is because he wants to ultimately connect it to the tzur, which is the root, like you said there. That's where that is the eish uchla. Yeah, the tzur elyon, the tzur achalamish. Like that's what he says there. That is the like the flintstone. That even when the fire doesn't seem to be burning, within it there is fire. Even when the neshama doesn't have, he explains in the Likutei Torah there, where it doesn't have the Torah mitzvahs that gives it fuel, within the tzur there's still fire. But here he's talking about how the fire comes down into Eretz and Kalim. So that's what he's bringing here. This is all a parentheses. So here's where we are. We just said that creation comes through Chesed, the flow of kindness and love. Teva tev lahetiv. However, just to sum up, in order for the Ein Sof to descend, which is to a far lower, infinitely lower level, both to create and to emanate, both even Atzilus, like he explained, because Atzilus is so distant from Ein Sof, and especially the substance of the spheres, Chachma, and so on, the Eretz and Kalim, what causes the ability to descend that far? Because remember, we learned Chesed is a flow, but the flow has a certain limit. So he now says, after the parentheses, how do you have this yerida, this intensity that is able to bring from Ein Sof all the way into the Eretz and Kalim of Atzilus and into Bria and so on? Zehu dafkin bebchinas Gevuros the Atik. This comes specifically from Gevurah the Atik. Shehu tagberes ha'atzmus. This is coming from the intensity of Atzmus. Atzmus has an intensity to it. To drive that the energy of Chesed should go all the way down, even to states that are infinitely distant from its source. Now remember, when he spoke about water on page 1335, he says water flows, but there's at some point it's going to cease. You need to have takberis to make it flow to a place that's far more distant. And that's more than, so you could see water flowing and then the water slows down. So what causes it to flow with this type of intensity to go all the way to an Ein Arech state, from Ein Sof to Atzilus, and then to Bria, and like he just said, the Sirida, he says that is the Gevuros of Atik, that comes from Tagbeirus HaAtzmos.
Can you say it lower than Bria, like,
yeah, most likely this is all the way down to Asiya. Yeah, but most likely he's talking here all the way because the lower it goes, the more intensity you need. So, yeah, for sure. He doesn't explicitly state it, but it's pretty clear. He does say chulu. He says, L'nivroim, what does he say? He says, Insel l'havas ha-nivroim v'gam l'hatzal n'etzalim. Yeah. So you need Gevurah of Atik. You need Gevurah here. Tagbeirus ha'atzmus. So in other words, Chesed represents the very fact that God wants to have a relationship. And therefore the loving flow of Chesed Yibara, creation, and all that comes with that, the goodness. And Gevurah adds the intensity that flow should go all the way, even to places that Chesed on its own would not have gone to, because Chesed is about Giluiim and Oir. He's probably going to explain it more, but that's essentially what we've learned. I know this is not what you learn usually in my Morich Chassidus, doesn't usually talk about this dimension of Tagbeirus, but here in Ayin Beis he does, and it's not such a common theme in Chassidus, just to point that out. But it doesn't mean it isn't a theme. It's just saying that you may not have heard it elsewhere because it's not very often where this is emphasized. Okay. Any questions? Let me stop here and take questions. As a matter of fact, I think I'll stop here, period, for today's class, because I see the next section is going to go a little more into Atik, what Atik is, and more details about the Gevurah of Atik. Okay, I'm just looking how far this goes. And then I see at the bottom of the page, closer to the bottom, third way down, 2/3 of the way down, he's going to start speaking about Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. Okay, so we're going to come back to our theme. And that's going to bring us back to Tzur. And he's going to answer the question that he asked, why Yud Gimel Midas Harachim comes dafka from Gevurah, from the Cyrus, from the Gevurah. Yeah. Okay. But I'm going to stop today's class here, but any questions, please.
He went now out from the whole entire topic of the Shimu that he spoke, the flutters. Now he's going in general to the Ayin from Gevuros, the Gevuros.
I think, based on what he said earlier, it sounds like the Rishimu is this level as well. Even though, because he said it clearly, just looking, in other words, Butzina de Kardanisa, though he calls that Gevuros of Atik, I just want to see exact lesson, because on page 13, I know I thought about this, because on page 1334, he definitely said that the Mokimiti, and it's Saft al Atzur, he said clearly is the level of the Rishimu. That he said explicitly. Now he seems to be saying that it's the level of Gevuros, and specifically Gevurah the Atik. So I haven't yet come to a conclusive way of understanding, is that the same level? Or is it one is rooted in the other? But there's no question that the Rishimu is rooted in Helam Ha'atzmi. The Rishimu itself is Koich HaGvul, so that's a Gevurah Dika thing. That's why it creates a Gvul. And it's coming from Helam Ha'atzmi. So there's no question it's connected to this level of Gevurah. I think he's going to spell it out later, but we definitely have to bring it together because it's all connected to what he's discussing here. Sheresh HaKelim, and the Kelim is definitely from Tagbetis, like he said in the parentheses that we just learned before. Yesh, he said that this Gevurah is like the Kelim, which comes from Tagbetis. I mean, basically, you need the Tagbetis both to create a powerful flow, but also to create Simsum and to create Kelim and to create a Koich HaGvul. So maybe he's going to come back when he interprets both elements of Gevurah. But yeah, we'll get to it. It's on my mind, that I can tell you. Yeah. Any other comments, anybody?
Yesterday at the end of the class, we had a long discussion about what does it mean, whether you can really know God if there's this aspect of God that is, I don't know, not measurable, if you will, at least on our terms. So was the conclusion that we're going to understand only why we cannot understand God in our own terms of measurement? Was that the conclusion? Like you were saying, you're never going to understand the Holocaust. We're never going to be able to understand it. We're never going to be able to understand why a cruel Roman soldier can crush a baby's head against a rock. So what is it exactly that we're going to understand when if there's a revelation of Atzmus, the Mashiach?
So first of all, I said, who said understanding is the beginning and end of everything? There are many things you can experience that not necessarily have to be understood. The mind is only one of many tools that we have. That was one thing I said. Secondly, I would phrase it this way, which is very different. As we grow and mature from mutva to murgish to muskal, and we climb the ladder and expand our containers and our horizons, our understanding of measurement also changes. You know, what a little child would call a small box, and they only understand their little box, that child, when they become an adult and grow, will understand measurement in many different ways. You know, because we first will understand that measure is not just spatial and time-based, physical time and space. We begin to understand conceptual time and space to the point that we begin to expand our understanding of measurement itself. What is measurement? That's why I mentioned quantum mechanics, for example. In the quantum world, measure is very different than in the macroscopic world. You can't measure things with a ruler. It's like the example that Sir Arthur Eddington gave of the fishermen who gathered together all the different fish from the seas and began documenting and said, okay, this type of species, these colors, these shapes, these sizes. And then he came to a brilliant conclusion, quote unquote brilliant, that there are no fish in the sea that are shorter than a half-inch long. And he was about to make his big announcement to the wizards of the world when his daughter, his little girl, said, what do you mean, Daddy? We have goldfish in our aquarium that are shorter than a half-inch long. And then, of course, became very apparent that the problem was the instrument. When you use a net that has half-inch spaces, all fish that are shorter than half-inch long will fall back into the water. In other words, the measurement, you have to know what you're measuring with. As we develop and mature our ways of measuring things, we come to understanding deeper levels of what measure means. And there comes the ability to understand that also from God's perspective to some extent. Like Mokum Arneina Min Amida is very difficult to wrap our heads around. How something could occupy space and not occupy space. But you could understand something that's beyond space. You could understand space. And then you could say, you know what? I could at least fantasize or imagine and dream about something that is beyond. Bottom line is, it's all through the avodah of a person. And being that God gave us the strengths as well, that we slowly abstract and we could come to understand things on far more abstract ways than we do right now. And then at the same time, God wants a dira b'tachtenim. He wants, in the world of measure, we should come to understand things that are beyond measure. So it's like structure is teaching us that which is beyond structure. This takes us back to Mamala Kalalman, Sevav Kalalman, Hu Mekayma Shalela Ve'ena Ela Mekayma. That in other words, there's how the divine manifests in our structures. There's how the divine transcends our structures. Then there's the divine that transcends even the transcendence of structures. And then there's a divine that combines and integrates them all. So all this is part of all Chesed, and depending what you're learning, you learn different pieces of it. And as you grow, you can come to understand, like I said before, you dias achiyuv, you can understand it directly. You could directly, then you can understand it through inference and through extrapolation. You dias hashlila, and then the shlila, yesterday's shlila becomes today's chiyuv. In other words, that which we yesterday only understood as by negating it, we can begin to internalize. And that's the process of growth. That which was yesterday a mystery, today is understandable. Now there's new mysteries. And the journey never ends because we're dealing with all these infinite levels. So it's all about our avodah of understanding and relating to these levels. And we're given many tools. When a person, for example, takes their hand and stretches it out to help another person and gives tzedakah, we're told that he's bringing infinite into the finite. He's bringing the mitzvah of tzedakah of Hashem, which is infinite, into a finite world of a coin that you're handing to another person. So basically, it's all about the chibur of gvul and bli gvul, and ultimately even higher than both of them, and the joining of all of them, and so on. So that's the way I would.
Nowadays, we're getting used to looking at all these progressions of levels in a state of non-time, and it's becoming like second nature to us almost.
Absolutely. Look, when you use your smartphone, your mobile phone, you're essentially transcending time and space. You can get any information at any time, anywhere. So we have examples of the invisible. The invisible is becoming more and more comfortable to us in this world. Where once upon a time, invisible forces were far more distant. Now they're affecting our lives every moment. We may not understand them, but they are definitely part of who we are. So yes, this is all part of the process.
On the other hand, I have to say, and again, I listened to your class twice after the class yesterday. It's a lot of time. It was an hour and 42 minutes.
Okay, class. I respect that.
But what I wanted to come to say, and I'm having given, I'm as hopeful as ever. But in the moment, I felt somehow almost further away from God. Maybe except when I'm a bad boy. but I felt frustrated. Like I'm never really going to be able to connect to God. All I'll be at most I'll be able to understand is that I can't connect to God, and that by understanding that there's certain things about God I'll never be able to connect to. Somehow I'm connected to Him. Maybe that's as far as I'm going to get. But all of a sudden I felt like whatever I'm davening to the extent I can feel a connection, because sometimes when you're davening really intensely, you can feel a connection. That even that's not it's not God. So it's some other lower manifestation of God. Maybe on Yom Kippur when I'm crying, we're doing the avodah of the Kohanim. Maybe I can feel something deep in my heart. The key of the shofar. Maybe there's something there that I can't. It's ineffable, like you say. But I don't know. I felt all of a sudden quite alone in listening to. Well, it's not you. It's the Rebbe Rashab explaining these very, very deep levels of abstraction in terms of understanding Elokus.
I have a few comments. First of all, just like today or yesterday, you came to that a realization. There's always tomorrow and the next day. So you may come to new realizations. It's not over. The journey continues. So you'll be surprised perhaps where this leads you. That's number one. Number two, I think one of the things is, remember, we're very much trained, almost like we're very goal oriented and very like, okay, I'm going to run the marathon and I'm finally going to finish and win or become in second place. Ultimately, part of the journey is where you come to realize it's not just about whether I will get somewhere. It's the destination is the journey itself. It's not about getting somewhere and feeling, okay, now I'll be rewarded because I reached a certain place. Every step of the way, whether you feel close or distant, is all part of the journey, and it's coming to appreciate that you're part of something greater, and that greater, sometimes you'll relate to it more, sometimes you'll feel more distant. That's why we say we're supposed to have all elements. There's areas that God is close to us. Just look at your life. When you say Moida Ani, and you say, thank you for returning my soul to me, that means that God is of a vote of confidence in you and wants you here on this earth. It's an act of love, of Chesed, and that's not so distant. Then when you start thinking about deeper levels of the divine, yes, you're going to fear more, not ava, but yira, reverence and awe of something that's beyond. And this is meant to continue to grow. And I'm no doubt you'll continue to grow. And that which you felt yesterday or today, you will ultimately find that is also close. And then you'll find new areas to frustrate about. Trust me.
Alavai. Okay. Thank you. Sage words. Thank you.
You should only frustrate about finding the deeper levels of God. There should be no other frustrations in your life, and you'll be in good shape.
Amen. 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 Thank you. By the way, you're really you've got your A game on yesterday and today. It's very, very amazing stuff, really. And your explanation, it's not easy. I can only imagine. I can't imagine what it must be like to try and explain this. It's hard enough to understand on its own, and then to explain it,
I'm explaining it to myself as well. Remember, I also have to explain it to myself. So
yeah, but I'm very grateful, because there's just no way I would access this without a teacher like you. So wanted to thank you for that. Everyone has to appreciate this is really tough stuff and not easy to teach.
No, this is challenging, but I embrace it, and trust me, there are things I'm not sharing all my own questions that I have, but it's great. What can I say? I feel like, look, when you're swimming in a little swimming pool, you're in control. When you're swimming in the Pacific Ocean, you're not. I'd rather swim in the Pacific Ocean than in the swimming pool, because you're part of an infinite mass here, and you just have to navigate your way through. But
yeah, it's kind of you to take us along for the ride. Yeah.
Well, no, it's better to be, to be a small fish in a big pond than the biggest fish in a small pond, right?
I think Malcolm Gladwell said the opposite, but I'm with you.
Okay, maybe. I mean, I know, listen, it definitely feels good. If you want to be in business, marketing is all about getting 100% attention of 1% of your audience. Right now, we're actually focusing the other way. We're going to very wide horizons here. But the beauty of
100%.
this is you can bring it back to your personal life right now, right here. Remember, like he said with Tagberis, in one drop, in one raindrop, has all the potency of all the Gvul and all the Bli Gvul of Atzmos. So the key is to bring it into your life. And that comes with a sense of awe. It makes you feel, when I read this, it makes me feel childlike in a good way, like reclaiming innocence and purity, because it's not about me in control and me owning it all. It's about, being absorbed by something far, far greater. When you look at it that way, that's the experience. Right. And that.
Well, I said it in a more depressing way. I feel like I'm never going to know God in the ultimate sense, but it's the quest, the journey is what it's all about, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and personalizing it and bringing it in personal terms. Yeah.
Although it's interesting.
Okay.
Well, one last point. I'm curious to hear your comment on this one. Like you said, this is not exactly the kind of stuff you talk about if you're going to be a Menachem Avil, God forbid, to go comfort someone who's lost someone or is experiencing darkness and surus. But this stuff doesn't play so well. Like if you wanted to sit down and explain to someone who is God or what is God, and not that you could ever jump to this level from the very beginning, obviously, this is fairly advanced, but nevertheless, this, I'm trying to think of a way, how do you, not sell this, but if I want to sit down next to my wife and explain how mind-blowing this is, like why this is important, she might say to me, like the conclusion I came to, that's pretty depressing. And why do you want to study that? Why, people want to think of God as great, and God is nothing but goodness. And I'm not saying this is saying the opposite, but it's saying God's not terribly reachable in his ultimate, being. So it's sort of doesn't sell. It doesn't sell well. Like, how do you make this appealing? This is it may be for people who like philosophy or who like mind benders or quantum mechanics. It sells really well. But I'm just trying to think about how would you matzamtzem this to explain it to the average.
When I learn it or teach it, I find myself actually finding this is the most uplifting stuff I've ever learned. So it's interesting, my reaction than yours. I don't see this as in any way, I see it being lifted to places that are completely beyond the little nonsense and pettiness of this life and this world, where we measure things on our own, and that's how I see it. So when you can convey that, that's very sellable, in my opinion. If sellable for somebody who's looking for, let's put it this way, for instant gratification and the pleasures of a July 4th barbecue, yeah, it's going to be hard to compete with that. But for somebody who is somewhat a little more honest and ready to step back from their own comfort zone and discover deeper truths, how do you sell something to someone who's comfortable? And the only way they can reach a higher truth is by getting uncomfortable. Most people don't want to be uncomfortable. Many people tell me, I'd rather be comfortable and blind than uncomfortable and seeing things. More knowledge, more pain.
Also well said.
So I wouldn't. I mean, I honestly, I wouldn't even have expected that reaction that you're having. But now I hear you saying it, so I understand where it's coming from, because I do see this as being like when you're exposed to Bli Gvul, it's going to frustrate you if you're a Gvul person, because you want things measurable. You want to think, you want to know that, that you've achieved a goal. You get your reward, then you move on to the next goal. That's how we think. Anyway, I'm not worried. Don't worry. You'll be very pleased by it all, and I'm sure you'll be able to convey it to your wife and to others.
Well, the orientation is phenomenal, as usual. Thank you. And I'm not just a person of Gvul. Hopefully, you should know that by now.
Listen. I wasn't an accusation. I wasn't saying it as critique. I was saying it just in general. We all have that challenge, because we are defined. You said orient. We have our orientations. The word that you used is the right word. That's what I meant. I didn't mean that we're stuck there. I mean, you wouldn't be sitting in this class if you were just defined by that, and that was all you're looking for. obviously. Okay, good. So let me stop there. So we're stopping in the middle of the page, 1337.